All right, fellow fact checkers. Now, before we start the show, I want to remind you to head over and check out our great sponsor, Fox and Son Coffee. They've got an amazing deal with all kinds of blends going on. So head over there and check it out. You can get the Mexican honey prep, the Brazilian honey prep, the Guatemalan, the Ethiopian. They'll be adding new roasts regularly. So be sure to check in and see what new flavors Steve has got over at Fox and Sons Coffee. They've also got all of your usual favorites, the Den Blend Dark, the Den Blend Light, and the one that we personally like around the house since we can't seem to agree on which of the light or the dark is better for both me and the wife, the Den Blend 2 Electric Boogaloo, which is the medium roast. So be sure to use the checkout code FCT for Fact Check This at checkout, and that'll get you an 18% discount on any order of $25 or more. Also, any order of $37.99 or more get you free shipping. Load up on all the greatest coffee on the market, and you can thank me later. Well, let's start the show.
All right, Fact Check This podcast, and the third of the recurring topics that we're going to be doing for this year. And this one is called History They Didn't Teach in School with my good friend Mark Metz. And tonight we're going to kick this off with Richard Nixon. I find Nixon to be a very interesting historical figure, in that everybody knows the I am not a crook. And a lot of people, especially people my age to your age range, probably know Nixon best from him being the president of the world in Futurama. And there's a lot of a perception about Nixon that when you start looking into and studying who Nixon was and his presidency, and also Watergate itself, and just the like kind of the nothing burger that should have been, honestly. Everything kind of there's this kind of this cloud of him being this really nefarious figure that he really wasn't. And
maybe a crook.
Yeah. But like once you start looking into Nixon, he was wildly popular. He wasn't some there are a lot of different portrayals of him in media that make him seem like this really shady character, and it's really not. That's not who he was.
He's certainly a complex man.
Yes.
Hard to get a grasp on who he is at times, but as far as presidents in the 20th century go, Nixon is probably, IQ-wise, probably one of the smartest, if not the smartest, who ever held that office.
Yes, brilliant guy. And I also think there's some of it goes back to the Kennedy-Nixon debates. The appearance that he gave there, like it's there's a lot that goes into the misunderstanding of Nixon.
Let me ask you a quick question though about your little intro there. I have seen 2, maybe 1.5 episodes of Futurama, so I don't know the reference. Is Nixon a sympathetic character in this show, or is he Nixon? I don't know. Or is he like the mainstream version of Nixon?
He's like the mainstream version of Nixon.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, he's kind of a ruthless, tyrannical type of a figure. Which is it's funny. It's played very humorously, but it doesn't give an accurate portrayal of who Nixon was as a you don't get a lot of the intelligence. You get more of the like being a crook kind of a thing.
Okay, just like a manipulative,
yeah,
top dog kind of guy who will do anything to get his way.
Right. And have you seen or read the Watchmen graphic novel or any of the comics from that?
No.
Okay, so in that Nixon.
I didn't know. Was this part of my homework? Because I didn't.
No. This is a just a personal test to see how much of a nerd you really are. But so in the Watchmen, like Nixon is the president and has stayed in office longer than what he should have, and has kind of taken a tyrannical sort of a role. So it's like it's the mainstream like portrayal of Nixon as opposed to who Nixon was.
Who he was. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's where I'm like that's kind of like that's the basis is anytime you see Nixon in mainstream, it's always that.
That's the reason we're doing this show.
Yeah, that's the reason we're doing the show, because like there is a I've talked about it a few times, like my belief that after Dwight Eisenhower, they started manipulating, but the people who actually run shit started manipulating presidential elections, because I've read Eisenhower's farewell address, and like when you hear the things that he says, I feel like the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, they were like, oh shit, we can't have somebody that's gonna like say that kind of shit out loud, like that you're giving up the game. So I think the people pulling the strings started to take a more direct involvement in who was running the country, and so that's why, like for instance, Kennedy ends up taking a limo ride through Dallas because he was not playing the game the way that they wanted it to be played. It's why, in my opinion, I think Nixon was given the choice of either you step down and have all this because of the Watergate stuff, or you get to take a limo ride through Dallas as well. And I think he like graciously bowed out and chose not, and allowed himself to be a villainous figure historically, as opposed to because at the time he was becoming anti-war. He was not playing the game the way they expected him to play it. And so that, and Agnew getting removed was all right. So I'm like jumping ahead.
We're jumping way ahead. You're
Agnew
good.
getting removed was even more shady than the Watergate stuff. And so like when my dad and I were talking about this a few weeks ago, or I guess about a month ago, when I was home around my birthday, my dad and I were kind of talking about this, and like he was mad, like to this day mad about Ford being, the only unelected president ever, like because Ford was appointed to be Nixon's vice president after they got Agnew out on some bullshit. And like my dad is 70 something years old and still pissed off about Ford being president at all. So like, there's a lot of there was a lot of shady shit around all of it. Interestingly enough, Trey sent a little video clip of Nixon talking about the media elitist complex, which that's another one of those things that it's like
the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy.
Right. It's, saying those quiet parts out loud that that the people pulling the strings don't like people in charge to be saying. It's
two earliest memories of Nixon, just as a kid learning about him in school. I don't know, it was probably like 6th grade or something. I remember reading the little blurb in the history book about Watergate. I had to read it like twice because I didn't understand it. Watergate, honestly, is the least interesting thing to me about Nixon. But I mean, obviously, we'll talk about it. But then reading after the whole Watergate scandal starts, he's elected. Election day comes 1972, and like it's the biggest margin in years. And I even as like a little kid, I was like, sounds like it didn't really matter. It's like, I was like, everyone liked him enough, and who cares about this stupid break-in thing? Maybe he knew about it. Maybe some of his aides knew about it. I don't know. We'll talk about that. But in the grand scheme of things, it was a nothing burger, in my opinion, a nothing burglar. Secondly, the Gerald R. Ford Museum is right down the road from where I live because I live in his home city. Unfortunately, that's not really a claim to fame that I enjoy. I remember going there for a field trip one day, and like the first video that you see is Nixon like resigning and then getting on the plane and waving away, and then everything else is about Ford afterwards. And as a kid, I'm like, I want to know more about that other guy. Like he seemed kind of cool. Like Ford's boring, but like that other guy, like why did he have to resign? Obviously, I knew a little bit about Watergate again, but like I just wanted to know how he went from being one of the most popular presidents to I got a piece out. So I've been interested in Nixon for a while.
Well, and you were right to be more interested in Nixon than Ford because Ford was literally just the puppet that they put in place to carry out the term and to do the things that they wanted him to do. Like Ford is the definition of the sock puppet that is put in place by the people pulling the strings. Like for whatever anybody wants to think about how conspiratorial we are with this sort of stuff, that there are, other forces pulling the strings behind the scene. I mean, all you got to do is look at Gerald Ford. Like that dude served no purpose other than to be the one that was sitting in the chair doing the things that he was being told. He did not have an independent thought in his head. I don't believe.
No, I don't think so. And I don't know, like his best move was pardoning Nixon, and who knows if that was his own decision or not. Probably not.
Right. There were probably some handshake agreements made to
beforehand. Yeah.
So
Richard Nixon, his mother was a devout Quaker woman. And his dad he owned like a gas station. His mother's family thought that she married down. She probably did. She was from a more like high class family than what his dad was. One interesting tidbit from his childhood is his younger brother passed away at a very young age. And then he also had an older brother who passed away in his teens. And so Nixon had these demons probably, throughout his whole life. And I think that I read somewhere that someone's like, he probably had some feelings of guilt that like it wasn't him and it was his brothers who passed away. And also like a feeling of like he had to achieve something for his parents who had to deal with the pain of losing two sons and him being the only one around. Which is, this happens in families.
Of course, you'd bring up the Quaker part since I've got a
yeah, I have to plant that seed. So his mom was a devout pacifist, like staunch pacifist, which is a Quaker quality. And when he was president, I mean, she was still against the Vietnam War, and he was, progressing in that direction, but he was definitely more of a hawk early in his career. And as he got into the Oval Office, it sort of subsided a bit, probably once he saw what a mess Vietnam was. But his some of the this is getting ahead of ourselves, the recorded conversations about pulling out of Vietnam, you see that he was not a pull out no matter what guy. He was, we have to do this the smart way. And he hated the anti-war protesters on the left, which I can sympathize with that, because they were kind of losers and had no sort of responsibility in their lives and whatnot. And their anti-warism was strictly like anti-American. And I mean, Nixon was a America First guy through and through, very patriotic. And he hated to see the troops bashed in the way that the Vietnam protesters did.
Right. He was anti-war in the respect that it was an unwinnable war, and it was a bad idea to have been there to begin with. And he understood the importance of getting out of it, of not of not staying in it to the extent that you end up really with what it ended up being, a complete egg on your face, like bad scenario. And he wanted to do right by the troops. He wanted to do right by the country, but he also wanted to get the fuck out. And that didn't play well with the people who put him in there to be a hawk, because like you said, like early on in his political career, prior to the presidency, he was very hawkish. He was more of a kind of toe the line kind of guy, and then he kind of, I guess, grew out of that or whatever. Like you said, probably seeing it from that close up, from that position, and realizing the reality of the situation. Then he, being an incredibly intelligent man, he realized, oh fuck, like we got to do something here. This is not a situation.
He actually referenced the parents of the troops a lot, in both in his campaign in '68, and then throughout his time as president, because the parents were his supporters. Like, these were the silent majority. Their kids are off fighting a war. And I think there was that feeling of guilt of like, these people support me and I want to take care of their kids as much as I can, and leaving them over there is not in anyone's best interest. So I think that was a big part of it as well. You hit on the debate thing. It's funny, in high school and in college, or like his first college he went to, like he was on the debate teams and was a master debater, if you will. Like his debate team won everything that they won every debate that they engaged in, and he was like the top guy. And when you go forward to the infamous one with Kennedy, where it's the first televised one, as you said, and his image just didn't come across well. He wore the wrong color of suit. He didn't put on makeup, as they had tried to encourage him to do. But it was pretty common knowledge that he won that debate to the radio crowd, but lost it to the folks watching on television, which was that may be a beginning of a major shift in politics, to where it becomes more of a performative art as opposed to simply facts and logic and policy and all that stuff. So, and this is something that Nixon was never really able to be comfortable with, is the whole performance part of politics. He's a very intelligent, smart man, but not the greatest when it came to public appearances.
Yeah, and you see that in like different interviews and stuff that he does. Like he never really carries himself well on camera. It doesn't matter what the situation is. Like he definitely doesn't ever look like he's comfortable being seen like that.
Yeah.
Like and that's not unusual for incredibly intelligent people. Usually they're not
I
particularly.
got Ron DeSantis vibes a little bit.
Yeah, they're not always really comfortable with being in the spotlight. You know, they're and it's why I think personally, I think it's why a lot of people who are very intelligent and wealthy tend to be the power behind the throne, so to speak,
Yeah.
in that they put their money towards people who do present well and who do go on camera, stay out of the limelight to every extent possible, and not be a figure who's seen. Or when they are a public figure, they tend to do so in like writing, not in public appearance type of stuff. And so like I think he would kind of fit into that category. Like he was very intelligent. He was very well spoken, but he definitely did not ever seem comfortable being the face. And like you said, like this was kind of a changing time. Like television was just really starting to come into its own. You know, I mean, we're talking about like within a decade of people saying that, you know, TV was a fad and wouldn't even last. That, you know, radio was the current, or was the present, and would be the future. Like there were still a lot of people who weren't sure that television would even stick around. So, you know, as we're shifting, this is a political landscape, a societal landscape. Like all of these things are kind of changing, and he was maybe out of his element for some of that, but that didn't take away from anything. It was just sort of it's what kind of framed the Kennedy debate.
Yeah. A few more interesting tidbits from early life. After he graduated Duke Law School, like his goal was always, or his plan was, practice law and then go into politics. He had an interest in politics from the earliest age. But World War II got in the way. So was it the Navy? I believe he was in the Navy, went to the Solomon Islands, and apparently developed a penchant for gambling. And according to one of his comrades, he won something like $5,000-$6,000 gambling throughout his time on the Solomon Islands, which was quite a bit of money back then. And he sent it home, and he used a lot of that money to fund his first campaign for Congress, which came in 1948 in California, which he won. And then that's what pretty much spurred on his political career. He was in Congress from 48 to 50, and then became a senator afterwards. He was a little bit a part of the, and not even a little bit, he played a pretty big role in the whole Joseph McCarthy Red Scare stuff. Another guy that is demonized, who I'm sure both of us are fond of, Joseph McCarthy. I think Nixon actually played more of the let's not be so brash about this role, while McCarthy was the dude that's like bashing people over the head, which is kind of funny in retrospect. and McCarthy blamed Nixon's sort of reservedness on his Quaker upbringing, as far as that's concerned. And then when you get to Eisenhower deciding to choose him as vice president, 1952, the Republican convention came down to Eisenhower versus Robert Taft. Robert Taft was the more conservative, think like Barry Goldwater kind of Republican. And he was definitely more isolationist during World War II, whereas Eisenhower was, one of the top generals. And Eisenhower was kind of like this Republican who they thought might run for president as a Democrat years earlier. So he kind of could play the chameleon role a little bit. And one of the reasons, so Nixon was actually in the running for the VP spot for both of these guys because Nixon's domestic policy aligned more with Taft's, but his foreign policy aligned more with Eisenhower's at that time. And so Eisenhower went with Nixon. However, there's not a whole lot to hit on as far as Nixon's time as vice president, because I don't think Eisenhower trusted him all that well. There was one time when Eisenhower was out sick, and it says that Nixon sort of assumed the role, but I think it was more Eisenhower's closer aides assuming the presidential roles as opposed to Nixon. So I don't know if you have more on his time as VP.
I didn't know. I didn't really. Everybody's time as VP is sort of to just not fuck things up, not be an embarrassment, and until you get a Dan Quayle or Joe Biden. But then they fail at even that much. Trace over in the Rumble chat, he says he symbolically took the role, like he was the vice president. There wasn't a lot else to say about it. He was a good fit. So I've talked about this on the morning show and other places. Like when you're picking a vice president, they need to check certain boxes, like the way that the political machine operates is they need to be someone that has that is kind of established, that has a record, that people know who they are, they're recognizable. They also need to be from certain states, depending on who the presidential candidate is. The vice president needs to be from a different part of the country to kind of wrap the vote around and bring different parts of the country together. He serves all of those. He's a good fit for that.
He was young, vibrant. Yeah. There could have been also, he had sort of gotten bad graces with the Republican establishment over aligning with McCarthy and the Red Scare stuff. So there also could have been a part of the vice president, especially at that time, was where politicians go to die. That's kind of what they tried. They tried this with Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century. The whole establishment could not get in line with Roosevelt for many reasons. He was essentially a wild card, and so they had him be McKinley's vice president, and they didn't think that McKinley was actually going to die, and Teddy assumed the role. So I wonder if maybe Nixon was a bit of a thorn even that early on, and they're like, hey, maybe position him for a VP role, and we'll see what happens from there. Although that may not track, because FDR basically chose a nobody who then had to assume the role of presidency not long before that. So
I don't know. It was a slightly different political era, but the VP was not necessarily at that time the one who was going to be groomed to be the next president or run for president next. So it
was up in the air whether Eisenhower would choose him again for the second term. And for so during the campaign of the before the first term, some controversy arose over some gifts that Nixon may or may not have received, financial gifts that he may or may not have received illegally as a senator or as a congressman. And so Nixon had to do some, or Eisenhower wasn't sure if he's going to keep him on the ticket. Eventually he calls Nixon. He's kind of going back. Eisenhower's going back and forth, and Nixon's like, well, there comes a time in every man's life where they have to shit or get off the pot. Basically telling Eisenhower, tell me what you're going to do. so that I can move, so that we can both move on with our lives. So Eisenhower stuck with him, but Nixon had to go and do some sort of basically press conference explaining what these gifts were, or if there were gifts or anything. And it's so weird. Like I watched some of it, and he's talking about how many homes he owns, how much they purchased the home for, how much is owed on the home, like all of his financials. He's just going over for everyone. And I think this may have been a part of Nixon's further radicalization, because I mean, who likes to stand before the press and just talk about their financial personal lives like that? So it's probably a weird moment for him, but a good moment for us, because it led to the press as the enemy.
Yes, that it did. All right. Speaking of the press as the enemy, do you want to watch any of that little clip? It's about 4 minutes, but we won't use won't do the whole thing, but it is very.
Well, they have much more power than most people would like to think. When we think of the media in this country, the problem is that they have a sense of self-righteousness, a double standard on issue after issue after issue. They can find everything wrong with somebody else, but they will not look inside and ever admit that they could be wrong themselves. And what was involved here in the Watergate thing was the unfairness of it. Oh, there was a legitimate thing to investigate, but they refused to balance it. They allowed their advocacy to get ahead of their reporting, which is their job to do. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address, wrote about and warned against the power of the military-industrial complex. I didn't get a chance to make a farewell address, but when I get old enough and decide to retire, and I'm not planning it at the moment, but when I get that old, if I make a farewell address, I think I would warn against the media elitist complex. The media is always talking about the imperial presidency, the power of the imperial presidency. I think we ought to hear a little bit of discussion of the imperial media and its power. You see, presidential power is limited by the courts, limited by the Congress. The media's power is unlimited. And some would say, but what about libel suits? Forget it. After the Supreme Court's decision in Sullivan versus New York Times a few years ago, a public figure cannot collect in a libel suit against newspaper or television unless he can prove malice. And there's no way that that's going to be possible. As far as the media is concerned, all we can hope from them, if they're going to be responsible, is self-analysis, self-criticism, and some of them are trying with their ombudsman and the rest. The other thing is competition. But what we see in terms of newspapers across the country is more and more places where there's only one paper. Take Washington, D.C. Since the Star left the scene, the Washington Post is the only major newspaper being printed in the most important capital in the world. I wouldn't like to leave the fate of this country to the editors of the Washington Post.
You think that the First Amendment has been misused or abused by reporters?
Oh, no question about it. It's used basically as a license. Let's face it, Sullivan versus New York Times is in effect a license to lie because they can tell an untruth, print an untruth, which some of them consciously do, if it's going to sell newspapers or what have you, or win a prize. And then they can always get behind the barrier under that case of saying, well, I didn't intend any malice. I had no malice.
So that's a terribly cynical approach, though, to people who are doing their best, who are going to work, who are maybe trying to sell papers, certainly, but are trying to tell the truth.
Well, let me say right at the outset of this conversation, I made it clear that I was not speaking personally. I was not speaking generally. I'm simply speaking of what I have found to be an unfortunate majority at the present time. I think it could change. There are a lot of very good, responsible reporters, particularly in the writing press. Not yet that much in television, because television is so consumed with ratings and the rest. They'll do almost anything to get a story.
Is there any way to get some kind of a handle on this situation? Should the media be investigated? Should it be controlled?
No, I may disagree, for example, with what some president does with his power, but I don't want to abolish the presidency, or I don't want to control it. The same is true of the press. I believe in a free press. I do not want government control under any circumstances or government censorship of either radio, television, or newspapers. But I'm simply suggesting here that all of the media should look within themselves, look through that microscope at themselves, look in the mirror now and then, rather than looking out there to others.
Who, when that stupid reporter asked, should the media be investigated? Who investigates the media there, Bucko? Is there, especially then, there was actually less alternative media forms at that point in time than there are now.
Oh, and Trey makes a good observation on the chat. He says he's so articulate off the cuff. You can tell he's thinking through this, that he's just thinking through this statement. Like, it's not teleprompter stuff. This isn't a prepared speech. Like, this is just him talking. And like, I mean, obviously this is something that he's thought through, but he's just articulating in the moment what's in his head. Like, this isn't some prepared statement that he's reading or anything like that. That's sharp. It's a shame that we do not have politicians who are that sharp off the cuff anymore. I mean, like, maybe a handful that could deliver something like that without preparation, really, just to talk.
He so after he lost in 1960, he ran for governor of California in 1962 and got beat pretty handily. And during his final press conference after that campaign, he said, "This is my last press conference. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore," talking explicitly to the media. So he developed a pretty sincere hatred for the media pretty early on. And this is 25 years after that, this interview that we just watched. And yeah, that's just an accumulation of all those years of thinking through in his head, like what these folks are like. And he's right. I mean,
well, and especially the way he calls out like we alluded to earlier, like his dislike for television and for that form of media. I think it may in large part come from that ratings driven, doing whatever you've got to do to get views kind of a thing. Like, knowing that that's the precipice under which they're operating, it would be easy to be distrustful of them. And Nixon wasn't a particularly trustful guy anyway. So, he's not going to have a high opinion of television media. Like he said, like he thought that there were people in the written press that were trying to do the right thing. But, television was continuing to be more and more ratings and views driven. And whatever you got to do to get the eyeballs is what they're going to do. And you've seen that now. I mean, here we are, 40 years later, more than that, 50 years later, it's only gotten worse. Like, his warnings about that are every bit as relevant as Eisenhower's warnings about the military industrial complex. Like, we've seen what both of them said about those institutions coming to full fruition in the 50, 60 years that have followed.
When he said, would you, what was it in that interview? The fate of the country left in the hands of the media, what do you say, media conglomerates or whatever he said there. I immediately thought of Yarvin's or Moldbug's Cathedral. I don't remember if it was him that brought up, like, would you rather have your life run by the president of Harvard or the CEO of the New York Times, or just some random person you open up to in the phone book? And I was like, I'm going to take my chances with the phone book guy. Like, I feel like I'm in better hands that way. But, like, pushing on that even further, you had the media and the deep state definitely ramping up at this time. Basically, those two combined are what created Watergate, right? Like we can even bring Bush Sr. and the CIA into it if we want to. And also Nixon's, so that's two parts of the cathedral, Moldbug's cathedral. And then the third part is academia. Nixon's hatred of anti-war, the Vietnam protesters. There are clips of him talking about how it's actually the professors' fault that they are the way that they are, because the professors have increasingly become more anti-American in his time, and this is a point that he's bemoaning, and he wants to basically kick all of these anti-American professors out of the academic system. So there's the cathedral for you, working in unison to take Nixon out.
And maybe that was a little bit of the Red Scare in the back of his head, kind of.
Yeah, there was that as well, which he was not wrong to be warning folks of.
I mean, yeah, that we could do a whole episode on that, looking back at post World War II and all of the different institutions where people were put in positions of power and influence, and what that has done over the last 100 years. So
one more interesting thing, pre-presidency, after losing the gubernatorial race in 1962, he moved to New York to practice law on Wall Street. And he thought that he was out of politics, but he like I said, he was interested from the time he could even know what politics were. So he had like this young following of lawyers there. So it's weird because you think of Nixon's like kind of like the people who followed him were middle class, like middle-aged folks, but it seemed like young people actually like gravitated toward Nixon, the ones that weren't like Vietnam protesters or whatever, or lefty communists. So he had these guys start following him in the law office that he works in, and they developed this. It's not a PAC. I don't remember what it's called, but basically they were funding Republican candidates throughout the country, and then Nixon was basically campaigning on their behalf. So by the time he returned to DC as president, he had helped so many of the young Republicans in Congress or even in the Senate get to where they were at through this sort of the system that they were running, this funding system and also campaigning system, that he was able to ask a lot of favors when he first got there, because they were there because of his help. Which kind of goes to him being really good at the more analytical side of politics and being that sort of behind the scenes kingmaker, as opposed to being like the front and center, like face of some political persuasion or whatever.
Right. That I was going to say, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, being the very smart, very influential person that, generally speaking, in modern politics, never steps into the leadership position, never steps to the front. They always stay at the back. But it was a different time, and probably because he had that following, because he had that kind of support group that he had helped kind of build up, and the interest that he had, that probably is what propelled him into going back and doing it again. Like the ones who fill those roles in kind of our modern era, I don't know that they ever really have the aspiration to be that figure, that front and center figure. Like they understand that their time and their efforts and their money can be better spent leading from behind and playing kingmaker without ever becoming the king themselves. Politics was a different animal back then, so that probably influenced him a little bit, and just his own aspirations. That I don't think the ones who play those roles in today's society, actually, I don't think they have the aspiration to that necessarily. They understand the power behind the throne kind of thing in a way that maybe it was still early enough in the power being wielded from behind the scenes, that people didn't give the same gravity to that as what we do, because we've gotten to look back and see, 70, 80 years of that being the case, and that there being people pulling the strings, and understanding that you don't have to be the one at the front. In fact, you're probably better off if you're not the one at the front, if you are the one pulling the strings. So
yeah,
maybe some very smart people are learning from history, and then some very smart people got to be victims of history, like Nixon. So that kind of takes us to him getting to the presidency. You want to talk about Agnew and some of that, and lead in however you want. You've done a lot of on this.
So it was 68 was a pretty close election. Nixon was pretty far ahead throughout the whole thing, and then I think it's weeks before election day, LBJ decides he's gonna like cease back on bombing of Vietnam, which obviously was a huge issue at the time, and somehow that made things better for Hubert Humphrey, right? Was it Hubert Humphrey?
I think it's right.
Or yeah, because McGovern was later. Yeah, Hubert Humphrey. And that sort of closed the gap a little bit, because it made it look like the DNC was letting up on their own hawkishness as far as the Vietnam War was concerned. But Nixon eked out that election. I didn't do you can hit on Agnew a little bit. Nixon also had like two really close advisors who kind of had the kind of the role, like they have the role of chief of staff or whatever, and that kind of means nothing in name, but it's basically you're the second-hand man to the president. So Bob Haldeman was one of them, and John Ehrlichman was another, and these guys were with Nixon all the time. They appear probably the most on the Nixon tapes that were started to be released like in the 90s, because they weren't allowed to be released for the longest time. And also Pat Buchanan, another guy who I think you and I both adore, was also a pretty close advisor to Nixon at the time. And as you were hitting on earlier, like these are guys who you just don't see in positions of government anymore. Like brilliant, like actually like Harvard educated when it meant something. Like now it basically means that you can repeat whatever the popular talking point is. But like back then, like these were brilliant dudes. This was not, obviously was not Goldwater's envision for government. It wasn't limited government that Nixon won on. It wasn't necessarily Republican talking points that you wouldn't hear from like George W. Bush and Romney, not really McCain, but I mean, obviously those guys weren't telling the truth when they're talking about like, we're trying to limit government. Nixon didn't really lie in campaign. Like he was looking for efficient government and government that worked. And these were sort of the guys that he leaned on to do that. What you like Agnew? What is it about Agnew you like?
Agnew was a good compliment to Nixon. He was very America first. He was very he was very against the anti-war protesters for the right reasons, like not because they were he was kind of what we were talking about with Nixon. Like he didn't like the anti-war protesters because they were fucking commies. Like and he was very unabashed about that. And like the stuff that they used to get him out of office was that he was getting, when he was the governor of Maryland, he was getting like kickbacks on road projects and all kinds of other stuff that there's like, it's this weird thing where they have extensive documentation of every kickback that he had ever received and yada, yada, yada. But yet it doesn't come up until they're in their second term after he was the governor 10 years ago or whatever, like 8 years. I can't remember exactly what it was. Like he was the governor a very long time ago, but it doesn't come up until they're in their second term. And Nixon, he and Nixon are both starting to turn like anti-war. And now now they've got all of this extensive. It was just really shady. And like very coordinated sources, multiple very coordinated sources. Not only that, but also very coordinated sources within these big public unions. So, the ones that tend to be kind of run by the government. So it was just, there's a lot of bullshittery that seems kind of evident. And he, like Nixon, didn't actually get impeached, and there wasn't a very extensive investigation into it. It was a lot of these accusations came up. They have all of this very extensive documentation proving all of this, and then he gets to resignation. Like, to mine, I'd have to go back and look. I don't think there were ever actually any criminal charges that were like filed against him for anything. Like, it's really bullshittery type of a thing that when you go back and look at it. And like I said, like he was a very he was a good compliment to Nixon as far as like having your president and vice president kind of be on the same team. That they kind of had that. So that's where that and maybe less about Agnew and more the fact that Gerald Ford was like clearly
he was the guy.
Yeah, he was clearly their fucking sock puppet. Like, because Nixon didn't get to choose Ford. Like, Ford was given to Nixon. It was like, this is the guy that's going to be your vice president now. Like, Agnew's resigning, and this is going to be the guy. Like, that's even. I think that's even more damning of it is the fact that Ford was not Nixon's guy. Ford was the deep state guy that they told him more or less, you're taking him. He's going to be the vice president.
Yeah, a lot is made about Nixon installing the recording devices in his office, also Camp David and another office as well. They're like, well, he freaked out. He got paranoid. He recorded every conversation that he had with people. Like, this obviously shows that Nixon is guilty of a lot of crookery and manipulative tactics and whatnot. And so, I mean, some of the recordings that you listen to, like Nixon does come across as paranoid, frankly. However, this is a guy who legit, and most people who want to become president, especially here at a time where it's like, maybe that actually meant something more than it does now. Like, this is a guy who did care about his country. Like, that's without a doubt. He wanted to bring more efficient government to his country. And he gets in, and it's not, it's not what you think. Like, you say, maybe he was brought to that room and shown the real footage of the Kennedy drive through Dallas. And so who wouldn't be paranoid and who wouldn't want to record these conversations to make sure that their ducks are all in a row, right? Like, I can understand like feeling the heat coming from all sides. Like, if I was given the option to install these recording devices, which were like now we're like, of course, every conversation's recorded, but this was sort of novel back then. I would probably do the same thing, honestly. And there are recordings of him like, yeah, I want you to follow RFK around and sort of bug his phones. I want you to bug, he wanted to bug Kissinger's phone, even though him and Kissinger had it was a pretty good working relationship, but there was one time where the war was winding down in Vietnam, And they had basically come to the conclusion that we are ending this thing. And all of a sudden, Kissinger goes and talks to some other world leaders at some conference and was like, yeah, we're going to bring a gradual end. And Nixon's like, no, I don't want any more graduality. I think that Kissinger's going behind my back because just a few weeks ago, we agreed that we're bringing this to an abrupt end. So he's like, I want you to bug his phone too. And I was like, this is a guy who he wants to be in charge, and he knows that he can't. He thought he was getting into a role where he's in charge of this stuff. And then once you get there, you're like, oh, I don't have the power that I thought that I would have. And that would mess with my head too.
Yeah, especially if you think you have agreements with people, and then it turns out that they have other pocket agreements with other people. And then it's like, yeah, I mean, I could understand wanting everybody to be bugged. It's like, I want to know if the things that they're saying to me are the same things that they're saying to everybody else, and are we actually in coordination? I mean, that's why Agnew was a good vice president for him, because they were in lockstep. They were good complements to each other. And so like when you have that person that you can rely on, that you can trust, and then you find out that you can't actually rely on or trust anybody else because that's not the way that this apparatus works. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. But yeah. I mean, again, was any of the stuff he was doing like objectively illegal? Or, I mean, it was...
I mean, there were some folks who knew that they were being recorded, and there were others who didn't. And I guess that's...
Yeah, it becomes gray areas.
But you're the president, man.
Yeah, you should be able to have everybody recorded. Yeah. Fuck that.
And there's
nowadays you just have Mark Zuckerberg do it for you.
Right, exactly. It comes through the private sector. There was a point where he like banned the Washington Post from being in the press secretary or during those press conferences. I can't remember what they're called, but I would definitely ban like I honestly like got to a point with Trump whenever he would have these meetings, like why even meet with the press anymore? Like they're not going to be honest. Just don't meet with the press. Go on Twitter live and like answer questions from your supporters instead.
And that Trey is talking about, he said that's kind of what Trump was doing, leaking stuff, but he didn't really have a coordinated way to handle it. Like,
yeah,
the lessons of how to handle the press and who the press are and what the press are should really be taken to heart in modern politics, and view them for exactly what they are. What's the Aaron McIntyre? You think you hate the press enough, but you don't.
Yeah, for sure. And what a lot of where there is like bipartisanship with Nixon is the whole China affair, right? Like opening up diplomatic relations with China. He kept that completely hidden and secretive from the press right up until like the very moment he landed in China. Like, what does that tell you? And this is a parallel to that is when Trump got into office and defeated ISIS. Like, we didn't hear anything about what was happening with ISIS for the longest time. That's because he kept everything hidden, basically ended ISIS's life support. And then we're like, oh, we haven't heard from ISIS in 2 years. What happened to them? Well, they were squashed.
That's something I've never understood is why are we like telegraphing everything that we do play by play to the media? Like, especially knowing like the media is the leakiest fucking thing on the planet. Like they leak everything all the time. Like keep stuff tight, keep it close to the chest, play it by ear to an extent and get shit done. Like that's, I wouldn't tell the press anything. Like my press conferences would be, I'm not answering that question.
Right.
Next. I'm not answering that question. Next.
For national security reasons, I can't answer that. Just say, give that line for every question.
For national security purposes, y'all are all a bunch of fucking rats and you don't deserve to know anything. So like, get the fuck out. Why are we even here? Yeah. All right. So let's kind of wind it down. I know we're getting we're getting to that point. So now we got Agnew's out, Ford's in.
But we didn't even
Nixon
say
in.
what Watergate was. You want to give a synopsis of what Watergate was?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume anybody that's listening to this or watching this knows, but run it down real quick and just.
So was it four guys?
Yeah.
Were caught breaking into DNC headquarters. One DNC headquarters.
I think that's right.
And attempting to steal information. Were they also caught placing like?
I think they were putting bugs
in
in too. Yeah.
Yeah, trying to bug it as well. And it was like when this happened, it was back page news. Like it was nothing. And then the Woodward and Bernstein, like it says they looked like the narrative is that they looked into it. I think that maybe there was an assignment like, hey, you guys should look further into this whole thing. Like I don't think it was this organic thing where they're like, oh, no one's looking into this. So they start delving into the burglary further and trying to trace it all the way up to the top and to possibly implicate Nixon and basically instructing this to happen in some form or fashion. And this was before the 72 election. And some of the stories were coming out before, like I said, before even election day, and Nixon still won every state but one, I believe. What? Something like
was it everybody? Yeah.
63% of the popular vote.
Yeah, it was a landslide either way.
Yeah. So I think and then it was just a complete saga after that. So Nixon is reelected, but his entire second term, or the 2 years or whatever it was of his second term, is basically answering questions about Watergate.
Right. While they unceremoniously cart Agnew out.
Yeah. Agnew, some other aides, other top officials resigned. Yeah.
They had to get Agnew out first because you can't, like I said, the two of them were in lockstep. So if they push the Watergate thing forward first and Nixon resigns, then Agnew steps into his spot and it's the same thing all over again. Like you're just moving forward with the same thing. And then they would have to start the cycle over again of trying. Now they have to try to, and that also looks a little too conspicuous, right? Like, all right, we just ran the one guy out on some, not necessarily concrete type of stuff. And then to immediately turn around and run the other, like they did it the right way. I wish we still had intelligent elites that knew how to, pull the strings of the system like there were 50 years ago. They got Agnew out first, very unceremoniously, without a whole lot of pomp and circumstance, and then inserted their sock puppet, and then they pushed Nixon out. So, and
there might be. So, like I said, Nixon was basically repeatedly attacked his entire the remaining time that he had left in that second term. And there is a recording so there's a trajectory of the recordings regarding Watergate where it's like, this is nothing. Why are they like focusing on this? Like, get them to shut up or tell them like, we're not even going to answer this question because we shouldn't even give it the time of day. To the more paranoid, like, okay, like what is this person saying about this now? Like, you should bug him because we don't want him to like throw us under the bus so that he can be saved or whatever. To their, like, one of the last recordings was Nixon saying, like, the guy he's talking to thinks he's joking, and Nixon's like, I just want to give it all up. And the guy laughs, and he's like, no, I'm serious. Like, I have nothing left in me. And he's like, if I am going to be president of the United States, then I have to have everything in me, and I can't. Like, I can't give anything anymore. So they drained him.
Right. They just wore him down and demoralized him to the point that he didn't want to keep fucking with it.
So people are like, "Oh, he resigned. That way, that's an admission of guilt." And I was like, "No, he said he had nothing. If I have nothing, then I leave too. Like, I can't. It's the most. I mean, most important job in the world. Okay, maybe that's not true, but it's an important job, right? And if you have nothing to give, then what's the point?"
Right, and I mean, he saw what they did to Agnew too, so like they're not going to stop. So like, yeah, at some point, I mean, whether they were going to have him take a limo ride through Dallas or not, they were going to effectively kill him one way or the other. Like, he was not going to be able to lead. He was just going to be a shell of himself. And he saw that, and he took the best route out that he saw available to him.
Yeah, I honestly applaud him for resigning. Like,
I mean, what's he going to do? Go through the impeachment and
yeah, it's just
public
humiliation. Yeah,
and what we've seen, I mean, he was a very sharp, very, very sharp guy. What we've seen every time there's been an impeachment is it tears the country. You have, both get very aggressive, very hostile towards the other sides. Like, resign, get out, don't even let it get to that point. Just try to maintain the best possible outcome for everybody. And I mean, that's what he wanted. He wanted the best possible outcome that there could be. Like, just have it be done with and move on. And that's unfortunate, and it creates a legacy for him that ends up being painted by the mainstream media, who he absolutely hated and did not pull any punches on how much he hated them. So they get to be the ones who paint his legacy from that point forward, and then we get what we get as the portrayal that is Nixon 50 years later.
One of his last press conferences, a reporter asked him, like, why are so many of our questions arousing such anger in you lately? And he goes, "Do you think that I'm sorry that I gave you the impression that I was angry, but I only get angry at people that I respect." It just felt like a mic drop moment. It's like, I'm not angry at you because I don't respect you. You probably annoy me, but I'm not going to give you the dignity of being angry at you. And so he does resign, and then obviously Ford is Ford for a couple of years, and then Jimmy Carter wins in an election that's just probably between the just two most boring candidates of all time in the 20th century, at least. And then obviously Nixon and Carter's presidency is a disaster, blah, 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 all that stuff. And then Reagan wins in much the same fashion as Nixon did in 1972. So I don't think the country actually changed that much between 72 and 80. I think it was like the values were pretty much the same. And then obviously Reagan wins landslide again. And everyone gives Reagan. Reagan obviously was 1,000% a better public performer than Nixon. Had he had Nixon's policies, though, we probably wouldn't be in the mess that we are in today. Sure, certainly wouldn't have gotten amnesty. So.
Yeah. Nixon was the superior president policy wise, if not, even though he wasn't the. Well, they figured it out, right? They started, the people who were pulling the strings started to understand what they needed to put out there as a candidate, how to manipulate the general populace into liking a candidate and having the right image so that you could sell the slow creep of communism without actually being directly forward about it.
Yeah.
It's That's why I don't trust anything post Eisenhower, really. I mean, I've said it many times. I think there was a lot of manipulation and strings being pulled for a lot of those, and it's also why you see anytime somebody gets out of line and they don't want to do things the way that those who are running those big power machines like the military industrial complex and the media complex, whenever they're not playing along with those, then they gets to go. And it's also why Trump gets such vitriol from the entirety of the establishment, because he does not play their game well, or at all, a lot of times. Got anything else to add on Nixon? I think we did a lot to dispel the Futurama Watchmen, like that version of Nixon.
I think I respect Nixon. It's ultimately it's a sad story, because as far as you look at where our quote elites are now versus like even that, like Nixon is so much more of an elite than anyone that we can put in office now. And obviously, like I said, he's one of the more intelligent people that's been in office, especially the 20th century. But it's also sad, like personally, because I do think that maybe definitely some paranoia did creep into Nixon's life, especially during the presidency, and may have caused, and he admitted it in some of these interviews he's done. He's like, I did make some mistakes. He doesn't say that Watergate was something that he perpetrated or whatever, but he's like, I made some mistakes. I was paranoid. And I think that unfortunately a lot of that paranoia came from, as I said, like he got into a position that ended up being what he didn't realize what it was, or whatever, what he thought it was going to be. And he genuinely sought out that position because he thought that he could be a good president for a country that he loved. And now he's demonized by that same country that he loved, which is sad.
And wrongly so. Like, for anybody that just takes a little bit of time to do some research and look into who and what he was as a politician and as a president, and kind of what his policy and stuff was. Doesn't take much to see that he is not the evil, villainous caricature that he's made out to be.
Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun. We're going to cover a bunch of topics like this throughout the course of this year. I might even talk you into one that you don't want to do. Maybe I'm gonna bully you into it.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We shall see.
It's either you or Clyde. You don't want to leave me with Clyde for that one, do you?
No, that actually sounds exceptionally entertaining. I'm not gonna lie.
All right. Well, we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, I will be back next Friday night. Are you going to join me for this? We're going to talk about why we're not black-pilled.
Oh, someone must have given you a good idea on that. You know what? I think I might join in on that one.
Yes. So far, it's looking like a pretty decent lineup. If you are in on it, I think James Gentleman and Eric of Rebel with a Cause, Josh Ham, who's a fellow Indiana guy, put together a decent little lineup of just some folks that have a positive outlook on life, and we're going to talk about why we're not black-pilled. So that'll be next Friday for those of you watching. And in the meantime, hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be back next week. Later.
Thanks, Justin.
Before you go, make sure you check out our great sponsor, Agorist Acres. Now, AgoristAcres.com, you can find over 100 varieties of seeds. They've got vegetables, flowers, all kinds of stuff. They've got heritage brands, everything that you want to start any kind of garden that you need. It's free shipping on any order of $20 or more. They've got cool packaging, and most of the seeds come in a fancy glass vial, no paper envelopes. They accept US dollars and crypto and can easily take either at checkout. Now be sure to head over to agoristacres.com, and anything that you get, use the promo code FCT at checkout for 10% off your order. I say all the time that you need to be starting your own garden, you need to be growing your own food, you need to be getting off the grid and becoming less dependent on grocery stores and stuff like that. Agorist Acres is a great first start. They have got everything you need for whatever kind of garden you want. Great people, great product, highly recommend. So go check them out.